So welcome everyone to our virtual webinar, BIOMEDigital virtual webinar, titled Manufacturing Success, 5 Secrets. I'm your moderator, Andy McMillan. So I'll be with you for the next hour or so. We have a lot to do in that hour. We have with us 4 panelists, and we have 5 secrets to talk about, and we have about 60 minutes to do it. So what do you say we meet our panelists? So let's start with Larry Jasinski. Larry is currently CEO of Rewalk Robotics, but he's been CEO of several next generation medical device companies. He's had experience with large and small companies, even in the same company, starting with Boston Scientific when they were 10 million and working through a variety of R&D and marketing and sales positions through 18 years as part of the team that grew it to billions. He's now, of course, a sought after speaker at a variety of conferences and sessions. So we're very happy to have Larry here. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you. Good morning.
Our next panelist is Tracy Walensky. She's currently Senior Vice President, Quality, Regulatory, and Clinical Affairs of Cirtronics Biosystems. She's also had decades of experience, hers in the area of implementing and maintaining quality and regulatory systems at a variety of environments at companies like Abbott and Omni and others. And she's done that in environments that include things like regulatory submission and global clinical trials and quality management systems. So she'll bring a lot to our conversations today. Welcome, Tracy.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Our third panelist is Steve Miller. He comes from a strong manufacturing process background, again with years and years of experience, involved in several new product companies utilizing strong contract manufacturing partnership models, extensive supplier experience, extensive quality and design control experience, and a firm proponent of Lean and Six Sigma. Strong contributor to our panel. Welcome, Steve.
Good morning, everyone.
And then Adam Shavitz, currently President and Strategic Sourcing Consultant at Strategic Sourcing Dynamics. He founded that company based on decades of experience in global sourcing, including Division Global Manager of Sourcing for Parker Hannifin for a number of years, and installing the Baxter Robot Global Supply Chain for Rethink Robotics. He also was an invited speaker at a variety of conferences, including Robotics and AI Summit and the Advanced R&D Sourcing in Pharma Conference. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
All right. So what do you say we move on from there then right into the content of our panel and go from there? So we have a variety of questions for our panelists today. And let me start with the first one, which is, how do you determine the right time to engage a manufacturing team? And I think all our panelists have a great deal of experience with this, but we'll start with Adam. Adam, what's your thought?
The right time to engage a team is actually a question that I've seen many companies struggle with. And the answer is really as early in the development phase as possible. If you are starting to have prints and concept ideation, the engineers are starting to formulate plans, it still wouldn't be too early. Typically, companies wait until a product is about to go into production or pretty shortly thereafter, and then you've got a lot of problems that are much more difficult to deal with. The heart of this is that 70% of cost, many of the quality problems, and many of the manufacturability problems are designed into a part. And so if you try and do it after the fact, what happens is your emphasis switches from preventive action, which is what you want, to corrective action. Corrective action becomes much more costly because your issues are already designed into the part. If you started the process too late, then you have to go back and do costly re-engineering, and your product line gets delayed. So the wrong time to engage, again, would be later in the process when you're about to go into production. There's an example that's fitting here that I work for the medical industry. It was a device, I can't be too definite here what it was, but think about a dental device that requires a specific light to cause a filling material to harden. This is not for a dental device, but it is a very similar idea. So there was an LED, 50-cent LED, that was not functioning within the very tight parameters that they needed, because LEDs generally are designed for signage. They're not designed for very tight tolerance. But they didn't find this out, because when they were prototyping, they just picked a couple of LEDs out of a catalog and put them into the device, and it was working. Once it started to get into production, they found out the batch-to-batch variation was too high. There was a startup with over $10 million in funding, almost got shut down. And I went in there and did a lot of work to get them the right kind of LED. We had to employ secondary optics, but it was much more difficult than if that had been caught up front. So just one example of how difficult it is after the fact to try and fix these issues.
Thank you, Adam. Steve, you've been through a few. What's your thought?
So, I mean, it's funny how, you get a mechanical engineering degree, you get an electrical engineering degree, software engineering degree, and everyone thinks if you put manufacturing in front of that, you're automatically a manufacturing engineer, right? But unfortunately, you have to go through and have the expertise, have the experience. So a lot of these companies also fall victim to putting people in these roles that they don't necessarily have the expertise to do, but they're subject matter experts, which is completely different, right? So, I think manufacturing engineer is a skill set that you need to look for.
Tracy, you came at this from the regulatory perspective. Do you have some thoughts about when to engage a manufacturing partner?
Yeah, I think it's really important that in the entire process that you're doing it as soon as possible, as Adam said, but that you're also talking to the quality side of the organization and including the manufacturing quality team in all of the conversations. I think they can add an element of structure, and they can also help translate some of the quality aspects from the organization into the manufacturing discussion. So I think it's really important to consider the entire organization, both operations and quality at the same time.
Great, thank you. Adam, I had a follow-up thought for you too, because DFM is frequently a part of what a contract manufacturer can provide, or an outside sourced manufacturing. What's your thought on that approach versus the DFM software that you can use in-house?
That's a great question. So when I say that you have to start early in the process with your manufacturing team, inherent to that, I view the supplier as a manufacturing team. And the contract manufacturer is really the tip of the needle in a sense. They're the hub, because all the sub-supplier materials are going to flow through that CM. So if you just try and do it on the computer, and I've seen this before, you will definitely not catch the kind of issues that you are working with people who are actually doing it every day and really know the subtleties of whether a tolerance or a material or a process is going to work. And the CM can be kind of the hub in that. And you should work with all the suppliers in the value chain, especially the key ones, very closely from beginning to end. So your internal teams, your external teams, it should be almost seamless. And you hear about that kind of approach with a lot of the Japanese companies and how they work with their suppliers.
Thank you, Adam. So Larry, part of your experience is with like billion-dollar companies doing things where you have lots of organizational units. What's your thought about when to engage manufacturing, whether it's inside or outside, but wherever it lives?
Well, early is important. I'd actually bring in one other discipline. When you originally decide your business case or your proposal, you really have the marketing team providing definition, and then the technical team will build to a technical spec they'll develop from that. The more you engage that part of the organization, as well as all the others, you'll do a better job of properly prioritizing a lot of the things you're trying to do there, and can help a great deal later, so you don't have things to fix.
Great. Thanks, Larry. I wouldn't have thought of that. Manufacturing engineering looking at marketing specs before you even have a paper napkin version of your product. So thank you. All right, let's move on to our next question. How can you achieve the best product optimization through collaboration? And just to put you back on the hot seat, Adam, why don't we start with you again?
So the first step is that it requires a corporate cultural change in most companies. Right now, it's very typical in new product development for it to start in R&D, be passed on to the next department, and eventually end up in manufacturing that then discovers a lot of issues that they could have discovered sooner. So it's a relay race. Each silo does its job, passes it on to the next silo. It should be thought of as more of a rugby game. And in a rugby game, the ball is passed back and forth from beginning of the playing field among all the team members to the end. And that includes internal as well as external teams. So first you got to start with a cultural change. How do you get that done? Well, that has to be through the incentive systems. Most companies that I've had experience with have struggled with incentive systems, finding that balance between incenting the individual, the team, the group, the internal teams all together, as well as external. You've got to come up with incentive systems that will promote the behavior that you want. Now, this can include things such as even an external rating. You can do a survey of suppliers to see how your teams are working with their teams. Just like right now, you're probably doing supplier surveys to find out other things, right? So you can do that as well. Internally, you've got to have incentives to make sure that all the groups work together. And it has to be a layer. Perhaps it's on top of the individual. Okay. Now, the next change has to be, instead of thinking of yourself as customer supplier, a very binary relationship, which often leads to kind of zero-sum thinking, win-lose. You have to start looking at yourself as a company as one niche along the value chain. And you've got partners on both sides of the value chain. Behind you could be raw materials, then sub-assemblies. Maybe you're the assembler. In front of you is distribution, all the way to the end user. So if you start looking at yourself as one part of the spectrum, it gives you more of a collaborative mindset. We're in this together to optimize the product to market cycle and profitability for everyone. And then that leads to collaborative relationships. The next thing that's important is to really understand the very distinct role of strategic sourcing. This is often misunderstood. It can be lumped in with purchasing, procurement. You hear, what's the difference? Well, if you really have a good strategic sourcing function, part of their job is to act as a bridge between all these various internal and external functions. So it needs to be a very cross-functional approach by strategic sourcing. They're also doing the lead work when it comes to qualifying, validating, and selecting the suppliers. So purchasing is the tactical implementation of the strategic sourcing plan. So part of this is you need a very strong strategic sourcing function that helps to bring it all together. And lastly, I'd say, think about new business development. Most people understand that concept. Consider strategic sourcing being the photo negative, the mirror image of new business development, but it's supply chain facing. Always looking for new suppliers, understanding what may be coming over the horizon, whether you should dual source or not. All the kind of things that new business development does on one end, they're doing on the supply chain side.
Tracy, you want to follow up on that from your perspective?
Thanks. I think throughout the entire process, it's really critical to include quality and the regulatory organizations in that collaboration. Nothing should be in a silo. It really is important that both sides of the house are talking together through these processes. And again, it really does help you, helps an organization not have too many hurdles if you include the quality and the regulatory groups in the beginning conversations and collaborate with them. I think it's really important that, management and quality leaders need to see quality and regulatory's role in this and not slow down the process and really engage the organization as a team.
Steve, what's your thought on this one?
I couldn't agree more with Tracy. I think her last point there is very salient to creating a very nimble organization, which is, you got to have management buy-in, that all the cross functions are going to continue to work together towards a common goal. The management buy-in, I think, is overlooked in some aspects, and then the teams aren't given that reinforcement that you really have to work together as a team to make sure that the outputs are met. There's a lot of times that you sit down at a meeting and you're like, you look around and you're like, I don't see the heads of the 5 families, right? I don't see quality, engineering, regulatory, right? So you want to see everybody that's is a stakeholder, even if it's a technical review, just to talk about some more innovative upstream stuff. You got to get people involved. And I think as you start to get more people involved, the best ideas start to come out.
So question 3, let's talk about question 3 here. How do you determine when to hold on and when to let go? That kind of sounds like a song, doesn't it? Anyway, how do you determine when to hold on and when to let go in order to best leverage external resources? And let's start with you this time, Steve.
Yeah, so like I said before with you folks, I'm going to give the worst answer a panelist could ever give, which is it depends, right? This is such a front end and back end loaded question. As you start talking about what's really important to your organization and what your business objectives are, you're going to want to understand, you want to be quick to market. You want to be at scale as soon as you're at market. You want to be at your cost targets first. Do you want to make sure you've got a commercially viable product? Do you have something that actually the market will start to pull on? All very important factors that will help you determine what is most important about how you get to market, right? So you may be able to take some hits on the gross margin at the expense of not necessarily knowing 100% that you've got the final product that will be the commercial solution. In that same respect, you might want to try to get your regulatory clearance on something that's maybe not exactly the commercial solution either, but could be something that you're going to enhance later once you've got that regulatory clearance, right? So a couple things to consider. I know that I kind of put a lot of onus on a couple of factors, but I can give you some examples. I worked for a company by the name of Raindance Technologies. And Raindance is a good example because they had a diverse array of products stemming from reagents to plastic consumables, injection molded, high volume consumables, to capital equipment. And they thrived in this genetic tool industry where they were doing unimolecular reactions in droplets, of the picoliter size. So they were taking, custom oligo primers and putting them into these very elegant droplets. And a lot of what they did was very implicit to the technology and very much highly proprietary as a result, right? So when you think about contract manufacturing, one of the things that's going to come up is, well, do you really want to have that go outside the walls, right? It's the crown jewels of the product, and you wouldn't want to risk anybody getting those formulations, right? So in the case of Raindance, for instance, they had a carrier fluid, which had a custom surfactant molecule that they synthesized in-house, right? There was a trajectory at one point in the company where, you couldn't build enough reactor vessel size in the building, in the brick and mortar that we had to sustain that, right? So there was a time and a place where that was going to have to be moved, right? So, you got to figure out what you want to protect. I think you also have to think about what is the cost to get into some of these activities, right? So in the case of, doing microfluidics, there's a big difference between doing PDMS, benchtop and, breadboard type microfluidics in PDMS, which proves a principle and gets you to feasibility. But there's a much big difference in making the capital investment to go and now do that in plastic at high volume, right? So in the case of Raindance, we did a lot of the custom microfluidic work in-house. We did that all on PDMS chips, and then we outsourced to Sony DADC. And we did that in their Blu-ray facility, which is in Austria, right? So here is a technology that is very cutting edge. The technology was able to make features that weren't ever really capable of doing in plastic parts for, mostly through, the 90s and into the year 2000. And even now is very challenging. So you can see how, stepping into, high volume by using different outsource schemas becomes a value. And following that thread, contract manufacturing, and then do you outsource some of your product development work? You get into this quandary as well, which is, okay, I've got this product development work that I want to do, but it's really kind of just integration of my breadboard into, say, a final developed chassis. And that's something you may or may not want to have in-house. However, you want to make sure you're the process owner for microfluidics, right? So, Raindance did that as well. They used a company by the name of Design Continuum, and they designed and developed their digital PCR platform, while Raindance held close to the microfluidics and the carrier fluid and the custom molecules and the reagents needed to do that type of work, right? The other thing is, your internal resources, when you have a product on the market, may get saturated with sustainment activities. in which case, going outside to a product development resource house that can augment your internal resources on the areas where you don't want to be, super embedded with the technology. You don't need to be the subject matter expert of chassis integration, but you do want to be, good at microfluidics. Then that's what you kind of start to do, right? So it depends. It depends on a number of factors. And I think, if you have the time to go through a decision analysis, these are the types of things you should be thinking about and bring forward and try to make sure that becomes part of the analysis that you do internally.
What are some keys to success when it comes to establishing a cost-effective, reliable supply chain? And this time, I think we'll start with Larry. What have you got to offer us on this topic?
Well, I think I'd look at that question. The why is going to tell you what the keys are. And, we've just put a lot of energy into developing a product and setting up manufacturing. So your dollars, your energy are gone. But why did you do this? You did it for a commercial end game. So what do you really need? Why? You need a healthy and stable production line, simply to launch a product effectively and to maintain it. But what happens when you've done that? Well, quality issues happen. That's an inevitable fact of life we all deal with. And those relationships are very important at the vendor level because most of these issues are vendor level issues frequently. Second, I look at this. Have any of you ever gotten a forecast wrong or received a forecast that was wrong? Have you ever got one that was right? Is probably the more correct answer. But flexibility. You need an ability to deal with long lead times and an ability to change when that forecast adjustment situation faces you. Cost. In the end, we all tend to wind up with some cost pressures because of the market or because of the way the products turned out. So if you come back to what are the keys, selection of vendors in terms of quality, in terms of relationship, ability to work with, controls, which again comes back towards quality and a lot of the problems you're trying to avoid, and relationship when you're trying to deal with things that are simply didn't work right. And these vendors can help you. It makes a huge difference. So those are the keys I would identify for a company to really be thoughtful about when they're setting up their supply chain.
Thanks, Larry. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question, because one of the truisms that I've frequently heard about supply chain development is you really need to have multiple sources for everything because that's the essence of success. How do you connect that with your thought about building strong relationships with suppliers?
Having multiple backups, you're going to do it when you're setting a product up. You may buy some things from one or another. You don't know what can go wrong with the vendor and what can happen over life. So secondary sources are particularly important. And volume is always a consideration there. Early on, it's a little harder. Later, it's almost a necessity for what you're trying to do.
Adam, have you had, you've certainly done lots of sourcing, so I'm sure you have something to offer on this topic as well.
There's sort of an offshoot stream of this, which is a trend going on now that people like to call reshoring. But when you talk about risk and lead times and IP protection, a lot of what's driving the move of manufacturing from being offshored to regional manufacturing, which is either close or in the region of your customers, to reduce the risk and the total cost of ownership. And I'm going beyond just because right now there's a lot of trade frictions. Even putting that aside, this trend toward manufacturing closer to your customers probably been going on for at least a decade. I even saw hints of it even 20 years ago. It's just been going slowly. Now it's accelerating. So I think that would be another part of it. Consider really the real total cost of ownership of bringing in a product from what you think might be a low-cost country. Maybe half the time, if you really add up all the direct and indirect costs of sending your engineers overseas, quality issues, the amount of inventory you have to make up the lead time on the ship, if you really look at it, you may very well be better off manufacturing closer to where your end customer is, in addition to the more typical things such as dual sourcing to reduce risk. The thing I would say about dual sourcing is not to look at it as an automatic rule. I think you have to look at it case by case, really. You may dual source something and raise your costs 30, 40% because you don't have the right volume. So, or maybe the best player in the industry doesn't have a lot of good alternatives. So definitely have a plan B, make sure you're ready to move, but you may not always want to implement a second source in terms of actually buying it on every single thing that you buy. Some of them you want to be ready to go.
Steve, what's your thought?
The inevitability is that you will have something go wrong, and you're going to rely on that partnership that you establish with the supply chain to help motivate and get that team involved and get to a solution quickly for yourself, right? So, I think I'm just going to echo what Larry and Adam just said, which is, the partnership and the ability for those teams to be motivated and to be involved with you is super key. One comment I'll make about sole source and secondary sourcing, it's definitely easy to say those words, and it's easy to do, I think, for commodity style componentry in a lot of cases. But you get into some of these sophisticated devices, and I've got a product now where I've got 4 or 5 things. Nobody makes it except for this vendor, right? So, in those cases, you got to do risk management and risk control around, okay, well, what if they do go away overnight, or what if COVID-19 has a demonstrative effect on their business? These are not simple solutions that you need to come up with. So having a good, emergency backup plan, or something that is out there that could swap in pretty quickly, that doesn't add any value to the work you're doing today, but it can sure save you down the road. So it behooves you not to think about these things, but think about them in terms of what really, if something goes wrong with, I guess prioritize, because you probably got a lot of different things you can prioritize on, but there's probably only 5 or 6 ones that could really affect your business in a meaningful way that you want to make sure you do.
I'd like to add one more quick thing here, and that is, in your organization, another function of strategic sourcing should be constantly looking at the sourcing markets to head off trouble, to see what's coming, to see where there's shortages that are building, to understand what's going on in the entire sourcing market, and to stay ahead of that curve. If you think about it, your strategic sourcing function should be the equivalent of new business development, what they do. Think about what new business development does, which is a more common type of concept that people know. The strategic sourcing function should be doing that, but on the other side of the company, constantly developing sources and knowledge of what's going on out there. So they're like an early warning detector, a canary in a coal mine.
Thanks, Adam. That's a good point. A little advanced understanding, it seems like a good idea, particularly when both Steve and Larry remind us that the problems are inevitable. So some forward sight is not a bad thing. Larry, I have a quick follow-up for you on this topic, because it sounds like you're proposing that we should have strong relationships with vendors, and so we can work with them. But how do you go about either identifying the vendors who can do that with you, or building those kind of relationships? What does that take?
It takes a lot of fundamental groundwork that you find those vendors and deal with them in a straightforward enough manner to where you can build a relationship. Because if what you're asking for and what they are able to give are a reasonable match, you can, even if you're doing it with multiple sources, you can manage it, but you got to be pretty straightforward with them. So volumes, expectations, timing are properly held. So more or less good practices is the way I describe it. But the quality side of it is always the hardest thing to measure. And if you're looking at these vendors, I would look quite a bit at your auditing process to make sure they're truly equal. In terms of relationship, you're going to build kind of off of that. If you get to where they're both equal, then your competence to reach to each of them is a lot higher.
All right, let's move on to question 5, which is, what are some of the ways to limit being slowed down by regulatory processes and paperwork? And that sounds like a question that we really want to start with Tracy. So what do you think, Tracy?
I think it's a great question. I think, there's really the biggest piece here is to focus on the big picture. And so there's a couple questions you need to ask yourself when you're trying to make sure you're not getting bogged down. And the first question would be, what are you trying to accomplish? So, the regulations are very broad. They're very broad on purpose, and they let you, the company, be flexible in how you implement the regulations. So you need to consider that when you're starting this process. And different companies, bigger companies, are maybe more risk adverse than smaller companies. So you need to really understand your risk profile as a company when you're starting to go through this process, and again, figuring out what you're trying to accomplish. I think the second question that you really need to consider is, how are you going to implement a compliant process, but still remain agile and flexible? And so to do that, you really need to incorporate a risk-based approach to everything that you're doing. So, regulatory should not be this big red no stamp. They should save those hard no's for safety issues and recalls and other things like that. I think you always have to look at options within in the process that are keeping you compliant, but that don't paint you into a corner. So that's, a very difficult thing sometimes for regulatory people. They want to be very specific, but I really think that the more you look at your options, the more you give your company different paths that they can take, it really does give you a lot more flexibility in what you're trying to accomplish. And lastly to that, you definitely want to work with your suppliers and your partners to find the best path. Sometimes they have really great systems that you can leverage so that you can continue to be flexible in what you're trying to accomplish. And I think the last thing that you need to do is really reassess what's going on from time to time. And so, is what you're doing appropriate for your company? Do you have the proper controls in place to make sure that you can address an issue if there is an issue? And I think we've all talked about there's always issues. And then lastly, you just have to stay flexible. And in that reassessment, how do you maintain that flexibility? And I have a small little anecdote from when I was much younger, and my very best worst boss gave to me. And he had said to me, Tracy, I can pay anybody to read that book. And he was meaning the regulations. But I'm paying you to tell me what that book means to me and to the company. And I took that to heart because, again, the regulations are very vague, and they're very vague on purpose. They cover everything from tongue depressors to pacemaker leads. So how you interpret those regulations really depends on what you're manufacturing, the risk profile of your company, and it does give you a lot of flexibility to make sure that you're meeting the company needs in that regard.
That's useful input, especially being flexible while meeting what seem like pretty rigid constraints. I think that's a powerful help to people. Larry, you have some thoughts about this topic too?
Well, I've spent my whole life dealing with the regulatory side, so I can give you a lot on this one. But real specifically, I had grown up in a company that really developed a strong regulatory system in a large company, Boston Scientific, and then I've since done a number of startups. And one of the things I try to remind everybody is the rules don't change, whether you're a big company or a small company. And for the smaller companies, we have to abide by the exact same standards really that face the larger companies. There are no shortcuts. And that's a perspective that anyone that's going into develop a product has to look at. And I think I can give really specific examples when you get down to things like labeling of your product, which is how you're going to get it paid for, how you're going to be able to train people on it. And the FDA is going to look at that. If you take too many shortcuts, well, I can do a shorter study, a cheaper study, an easier program, and then I'll go back and fix that later. Well, you've just made your process really longer to what you really want to market, what you really want to make your commercial being around. So a lot of that has to be well done up front, if you look at it. And as you do new technologies, you do face an agency that is changing just like society changes. They've gotten better in a lot of things. Working with the agency, but dealing with cybersecurity is a major concern, and all of our products almost these days seem to have software, and they're developing the regulations. They're not unreasonable, but they still change. If you make products that are using batteries, again, the standards are changing. So when you develop in year one, they are not likely going to be the same entirely in year three. So part of your regulatory pathway beyond just getting the definitions correct and planning to the end game are also around anticipating how the world's going to change around you for things like cybersecurity.
Steve, how about you? What do you think on this topic?
Everyone is looking to be accountable for quality and regulatory, right? And that the aspects of that, I think, go deep into the moral fabric of the organization. And it really needs to be understood. Some folks will complain about having to do all of, writing all the protocols, writing all the test reports, doing gauge R&R studies, right? but they're all super germane to the net output, which is what ultimately what the company wants, which is a high quality product that's compliant and that is commercial, right? And so, you know, strong buy-in from the leadership team, strong buy-in from the management team in the cross functions, and support of the regulatory and quality group continuously through that process. I think you'll find that if you get to this, you know, Narnia state where you've got all these systems in place, people can do it and they can do the work. And once you get those systems in place, that can be an uphill battle, getting that buy-in. But once you do it, you'll see that the net effect is something that you can reproduce. And now, if you're going to be rapid with a couple different products, or start to do line enhancements, that same process can be followed. And everyone has the same rules of the road. You can be very quick and nimble. So it's great to have leaders like Tracy who can come in and kind of establish that and do the interpretation for these folks and say, no, I realize it says this, but this is what it means, and this is how we need to transfer this particular product, to a realizable product through this matrix of deliverables, right?
Let me follow up just a second with that, because this idea of having an expert like Tracy who can identify and clarify and qualify, with that expertise as a part of your solution set, what's the role of the leadership in a company in this quality and regulatory domain?
What a great question. So management buy-in, right? And the management involvement, setting the expectations correctly across the organization that quality and regulatory are germane to the process. They exist as a cross-function that is here to get us to the next level. But management has the responsibility to make sure that all the cross functions are involved and participating within the processes that the quality and regulatory teams have identified as germane.
So Tracy, I want to follow up question with you as well. I wanted just to follow up on your point that there's potentially quality expertise and quality systems and suppliers that you can tap. How would you go about that? Or do you have an example of where that's worked for you before?
Wow. Yeah, I think it's really important when you're talking to your suppliers to be able to leverage their systems if they're something you can utilize. And generally nowadays they really are. And I think it's really important because you're not having to reinvent wheels. You can utilize, their supplier management for certain things. I've worked at companies where we've had to own our vendors' suppliers because they couldn't manage that, and that's very difficult. And I think in the process when you're working with your suppliers in the very beginning and setting up those discussions and setting things out in a quality agreement, it's really important to understand each other, whose role is you're going to use for what situation. And I think in the end, a lot of times small companies, like my company is quite small, we utilize our vendors' situations, we utilize our vendors' quality systems for a lot of different things, because we're not going to bring that in-house for various things. Specifically, we're not going to manufacture. So we are really always working with our partners to make sure that we have a strong manufacturing process. And to do that, I need to count on my suppliers to be able to deliver certain things, KPIs, things that then I can take in that information and continue to grow what we're doing.
Now that we've finished up with the 5 secrets and we're about out of time, I would like to take just a minute here to have each of our panelists give the audience like the one takeaway thought that they would suggest they leave the webinar with. So let's start with Larry.
Reaction and an answer would be, and I was listening to the quality piece that drove me in this and regulatory, the inevitable pressure of a small company is around the new concept, the new idea, and the pressure to cut corners and allow R&D to drive something too much or other disciplines to drive something too much without the other disciplines is something that the leadership must absolutely find a way not to allow to happen. Dragging quality in at a high level, and dragging's the wrong word, but it's the point, that the whole company has to get it. for both regulatory, clinical, and other things. I think it is a function that unfortunately has to be pushed onto an organization from the top in order to make sure it penetrates the entire organization. And that would be, my biggest takeaway in listening to different things today. And again, that's more of a small company problem than a big company problem.
Thank you, Larry. Adam, what's your thought?
I think one of the main underlying themes is to understand all the different departments that have critical input, whether it's customer facing all the way through manufacturing, R&D, and quality, and make sure that they're not functioning in silos. And that, as I said, they're not acting as a relay race, they're acting more as a rugby game with the ball being passed back and forth until that product gets to market. So that collaboration, which includes along the supply chain, is key to meeting cost and quality and time to market goals.
Great, thank you. And Tracy, what would be your one takeaway?
Well, Adam took mine, the collaboration, but so I'll come up with a different one. And that would be, don't leave your quality and regulatory group out of the process. So it's a little bit of both what Larry and Adam said. It's, I think it's the tides have shifted significantly, considering back when I started this, the regulatory and quality were usually the redheaded stepchild. So now, management has finally figured out that it's critical to the success of the company. They are part of the organization and not just something to tell you all the things you're doing wrong. So with that, I would say collaboration is critical, and to do that, you need to include the quality and regulatory group up front.
Great, thank you. So Steve, what's yours?
They all took my answer, so that's fine. I'm going to go back to core competencies, and I love that phrase, because I think when you're talking about contract manufacturing organizations or product development organizations, you got to know what you want to be good at when you grow up and you get big and you go commercial, right? So my examples associated with microfluidics and chassis integration, those are all germane to how you want to get to market, right? So you want to really make sure that your vendors know their own core competencies. You want to make sure internally you know what you want to be good at, and then look for people that play well with that structure of what you want to be good at and what core competence you have externally and what core competencies you want to have internally long term.
So let me take a moment to thank our panelists, Larry and Tracy and Steve and Adam. We appreciate you taking the time to sit and chat with us for a little bit. And to all of the people who've joined us here and spent time. We hope that in this process you've had a chance to learn some useful things that will help you support your own company's product development and transition to manufacturing process. This webinar has been brought to you by Cirtronics, a leading New England medical device manufacturing company, and we wish you well. Thank you and good day.